Folklore is full of stories and legends, but perhaps the most famous are King Arthur and Robin Hood.
Yeah, so for this week's podcast on English.com, we're talking about Robin Hood. Richard, what do you remember about Robin Hood from when you were little?
When I was little, well, I read a book about Robin Hood, and also there were lots of films.
Yes.
He was a character from hundreds of years ago who had a band of merry men, and he robbed from the rich and gave to the poor.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that he first appeared in a poem way back in 1370.
Wow. So was he a real person then?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. Robin, as you know, is short for Robert. That's a very common name. And Hood is also a very common surname.
I suppose after such a long time, 650 years, the story changes as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. One thing has been consistent is that he was always described as an excellent archer.
All right, okay. He used a bow and arrow.
Yeah. He hated the Sheriff of Nottingham, and he had a group of men.
Yes, the merry men. I wonder why they were called merry. Perhaps they liked a drink or two.
Actually, it comes from the phrase merry man, and that just means follower in Old English.
All right, okay. What about the green then? He always wears green in the stories.
Yes, he did wear green, but the reason wasn't to hide in the forest.
Right.
Because he wore green because it was a very expensive colour.
So how was it expensive then?
To get green, they dyed the cloth first in blue and then they over-dyed it in yellow to get green.
So there's no green dye. They need two mixtures.
Yeah.
A mixture.
So that took a long time to do, more difficult to do. So the cloth was more expensive.
So he stole his expensive clothes from the rich then?
Yes, but the stealing from the rich and giving to the poor wasn't exactly the original Robin Hood.
What do you mean? That's a big thing about Robin Hood. He stole from the rich, gave to the poor.
Yeah, it was kind of added on fairly recently though, Richard.
Oh, that's a shame.
And actually, in fact, Richard, the Robin Hood stories weren't actually written for children until the 19th century.
Okay, Jackie, let's go back to the story, though. He had his merry men, didn't he? Who was your favourite character? True or false?
Well, actually, Richard, I didn't have a favourite character, but what I liked most about Robin Hood was that he lived in the forest and he lived in the trees. I always wanted, as a little girl, to have a tree house, and that's what I wanted, to be part of the merry men and to live in a tree. What about you?
Friar Tuck.
Oh, really? Because he was fat.
He was a big fat man, but he was very jolly.
He was very jolly. Anyway, true or false, everybody loves Robin Hood.
Here's a structured outline of the podcast with idioms and expressions explained. Discussion on childhood memories. Richard, when I was little, I read a book about Robin Hood and watched films. He had a band of merry men, and he robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Idiom, band of merry men. Explanation, this refers to a group of people who share a common goal or purpose. In Robin Hood's case, they were his followers. Example, she had her own band of merry men at work, always ready to help. Historical background. Sarah, it's amazing to think he first appeared in a poem way back in 1370. Was he a real person then? Richard, the short answer is we don't know. Robin was short for Robert, a common name, and Hood was a common surname. Expression, the short answer. Explanation, used to give a quick and concise response to a question. Example, the short answer to whether we'll meet today is no, but I'll explain later. Consistency of the legend. Richard, one thing that's been consistent is that he was always described as an excellent archer. Expression, been consistent. Explanation, something that remains unchanged over time. Example, her hard work has been consistent throughout her career.
The merry men. Sarah, he had his merry men. I wonder why they were called merry. Richard, the phrase merry man in Old English means follower thought.
The green clothes. Sarah, what about the green? He always wears green in the stories. Richard, he did, but it wasn't to hide in the forest. Green was an expensive color made from dyeing cloth blue and then yellow. Expression, expensive color. Explanation, refers to something valuable or costly, often used metaphorically to indicate something rare. Example, that fabric is an expensive color due to its complex production. Modern additions to the legend. Richard, the idea of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor was added on fairly recently. Idiom, added on. Explanation, to include or append something new. Example, new rules were added on after the meeting. Favorite characters. Sarah, who was your favorite character? Richard, Friar Tuck. He was a big fat man but very jolly. Idiom, jolly. Explanation, someone who is cheerful and lively. Example, the jolly old man always made everyone laugh at the party. Sarah, at school, we learn many subjects like history and physics, but are we missing out on more practical skills? This week on English Daily Podcast, Richard and I are discussing what life skills should be taught in school to better prepare students for the real world.
At school, students learn many subjects such as history and physics, but perhaps they should also learn more practical skills as well.
Yes. So for this week's podcast on English.com, we're talking about what practical subjects we should learn at school.
Now, I think, Richard, the most practical skill, a life skill, is cooking. Why do so few schools teach that?
Yes, because I can remember I really only started cooking after university when I was living on my own.
I don't think I started to learn how to cook properly until I was well into my 20s or 30s. That sounds crazy. So I think learning where food comes from, learning about which food is good for you.
And also which food is bad for you as well, of course.
And learning how to make proper meals. This is important.
Yes, especially nowadays, it seems to be very, very easy for people to buy ready-made meals.
Or takeaways.
Yeah, and they're bad for you as well. I think there's a real problem that people do eat badly, and this makes them unhealthy.
And so there's the science included as well, Richard, isn't there? How ingredients work together, measuring things, taking temperatures. Being able to cook, I think, is an essential skill.
Yes, and also it's much cheaper, isn't it, eating at home than going out to a restaurant or ordering a takeaway. Another important skill I think that people should learn at school is about first aid.
Ah, yes.
I think the most important thing is CPR, isn't it?
That's what you do if someone is not breathing.
Exactly. But there are plenty of other things that people need to know about as well.
Okay, for example?
Well, burns.
Right.
What do you do when you burn yourself? They're very common in the home, and knowing what to do can help. And knowing when to call the doctor and when you can deal with it yourself.
Exactly.
And sprains as well, very, very common. What do you do when you sprain yourself? Or even if you cut yourself, how to stop bleeding is another important example.
And you know what I think, Richard? If you know how to deal with these things, you're less likely to panic. And all of this can be incorporated into the more academic subjects of biology and anatomy.
Exactly.
Another skill, Richard. Now, this sounds a bit funny, but I think mending. Now, I'm talking about darning a sock, sewing on a button, taking up trouser legs that are too long. We live in a world where it has become acceptable to throw good stuff away, clothes, right? So that can be linked to environmental studies.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. And I would also add basic DIY skills, putting up shelves, changing a plug or a fuse, and using basic tools like hammer and nails, screwdriver, and a spanner.
Yeah, these are all, I think, really important things for kids to learn at school, rather than avoiding using them as adults.
Or throwing things away.
Exactly. So, what do you, the listener, think? Which other skills or subjects should be taught in school?
Idioms and expressions.
Life skill. Meaning, a basic ability necessary for full participation in everyday life, such as cooking or first aid. Example, learning how to budget is a crucial life skill everyone should master. Ready-made meals. Meaning, pre-prepared food that requires little or no cooking, often considered less healthy. Example, I rely on ready-made meals when I'm too tired to cook. Deal with. Meaning, to handle or manage a problem or situation. Example, knowing how to deal with emergencies can save lives. Essential skill. Meaning, a necessary or vital ability for functioning in everyday life. Example, first aid is an essential skill that everyone should know. DIY. Meaning, do-it-yourself refers to making, building, or repairing things on your own, rather than hiring professionals. Example, learning some basic DIY skills can save a lot of money on home repairs.
Sarah, from cooking to first aid, and even basic DIY skills, there's so much more that could be taught in schools to help students in real life. What other practical skills do you think should be added? Let us know. Thanks for listening to this episode of English.com. See you next time.